west pivot over here, and these are the plots that are established on the west side. We established the cover crop in the winter of 2018 following corn harvest. The cover crops treatments were planted on November the 14th. We had the 3 treatments, of course, one being the fallow, the second treatment just wheat, and then the third treatment was actually a mixed species. We had turnips, radishes, wheat, and triticale. And our cover crop mixed species treatment in 2018, I'm going to talk in more detail about that, but we really had some questions. We had challenges getting the seed planted. We had issues with germination with the wheat and triticale. Consequently, we ended up changing seed suppliers and going with a different mix. But we picked this mix after visiting with some of the cover crop dealers and wanting to do something that would be promoted to the farmers in this region. We didn't want to go and pick this crazy mix that's being promoted in the Midwest because it would not be realistic to what you would have and what you would do. So that is how that mix was decided on. Then we planted cotton on May the 7th. We had 90 grow 3385, and then the cotton was harvested on November the 8th. So one of the things going into this, and as we look at cover crops and these corn cotton rotations, is this very narrow window we have between planting the cover crop and actually going in to terminate it. And so we actually didn't see the cover crop start germinating until late March 2019. So just standing at the edge of this field, this is what I was seeing out here. And from the edge, it didn't look like we were actually seeing much. Now actually going out and walking through the plots, and actually saw some early germinating wheat, and I could start to find radishes germinating at that time. But nevertheless, we're in March, late March, and we know we're going to be planting cotton in May. And so is this really even going to give us any benefit? So that was, one of the things, initial thoughts going in and looking at this. Okay, year one, we're not seeing much activity, and this might not even work. These pictures were taken on March the 27th of last year. And here's some little pictures of the little bitty radishes out there. And then flipping over the crust, this was actually some of the small grain seeds, some triticale, and it just never even germinated. So, that was another issue. It's like, okay, so we planted this mixed species, we don't have any small grains out here. The turnips never came up. All we're seeing are radishes. It's kind of like, crap, this is going to be a flop. But nevertheless, we proceeded with it as it was. And then it came time for termination. And so termination became actually pretty complicated. We had only had about 1 month of actual growth. This is the wheat over here. And then looking at the wheat was actually looking so good, Sam decided, I don't want to kill the wheat. This is looking pretty good. So he only chemically terminated the mixed cover. We kept the wheat, and then he strip-tilled everything, including the wheat cover and the fallow. And so, of course, we're going to come in and plant into those strip-till marks. Now, after the cotton was emerged, the entire field was sprayed with Extendamax Roundup and Warrant. And so at that time, it was early June, and I have those dates in here, but early June, that's when the wheat was actually terminated. So the cotton was planted into live cover. Some of the other field measurements that we included throughout the season, of course, I mentioned soil sampling. Also, lots of gypsum block measurements out there, and Curtis has been responsible for that, and we're so thankful that he's out there taking those weekly measurements doing that. These are actually some of the gypsum block profiles from the field, and so looking at these, and with the lighting in here, it might not be clear, but this line right here actually shows the cotton planting date on May the 7th. This top plot is a combination of the fallow plots. This is a combination of the wheat plots, and this is a combination of the what would be the mixed cover. Essentially, it was just radishes. And so looking at these two, the fallow and the mix, there was actually no difference pretty much in the water profiles. But when we actually look at the wheat cover, we saw this dip right here, and this is actually at 6 inches and at 1 foot. So we saw where that actively growing wheat was actually utilizing moisture at this point. So we did have a little over 3.7 inches of rain during that fallow cover crop period. And so that really did help refill that with rain that we had in May. So what we saw was that the soil moisture actually came back to close to a little over 95% of what would be available close to field capacity in June because of all the rain that we had. So this year, a wet spring, early June, we actually negated the benefit, or not the benefit, but negated the water use from that cover crop. One of the things that I do want to point out is that even though we are doing large on-farm plots with Stan, we also have these plots replicated. And that was something that I know Stan, was, kind of like, oh, I gotta do replications, because it is a pain. We have these replications out here, but it really is important that we are able to capture the variability across the field. And of course, Nick showed those soil maps that they did last year, and you saw the variability in soils. And if we only had a plot in one location, and the difference we saw, it might be due to soil, or is it due to a planting error, or due to something, rather than if we have multiple plots, we're able to get a good average. It's not any different than the difference you see on your yield monitor. You have good spots in a field, bad spots in a field, but your field average is a combination of all of those. So we really do want to make sure these are replicated so that we can get a good average of what's going on across this field. So these are from replicated plots, and these are averages with that. And then of course, as I mentioned, the soil moisture came up. Another thing to notice though, and it's actually pretty interesting, is that when we actually look at the water use, we have the gypsum blocks down to 4 feet. But with our cotton, we did not see this blue bar right here is actually 4 feet. So this is looking at the entire cropping season. And we never saw that cotton water use extend down into that 4 foot, or very deeply, when it actually came back up throughout that season. So when we did get extraction down, we were able to refill that very quickly. So as we look at, I think, the corn cotton rotations and the dynamics between that is something that's very interesting about it. Another thing to point out with regards to these soil water extraction patterns from the gypsum blocks was the soil water extraction was much more rapid in the wheat cover due to more vigorous seedlings. And so that's something I'm going to talk about in more detail. In our fallow, as well as where we had the radishes, the cotton seedling growth and development was very slow. But where we had that wheat cover, those cotton plants just took off very quickly, and the development was very rapid. And so we saw a much more rapid water extraction in those plots from that. We also did double ring and filtrometers measurements across the field so that we can measure the hydraulic conductivity. And so, of course, when we look at cover crops and increasing soil organic matter, ideally we want to, with our organic matter, we want to increase the rate of infiltration into the soil. And so that you don't want the runoff, you want that water going into your soil. So we're actually trying to quantify that over the next several years with the different treatments as well, using these double ring infiltrometers. And what we saw actually following termination with our cover crops last year with the radishes was that even in the first year having the wheat versus the radish, we actually saw some surprising differences with 1 year, just a month or two of growth with those cover crops. So this blue bar is the fallow, this gray bar right here is what would be the blend or those radishes, and then this orange line is the wheat cover crop. And on the y-axis over here is infiltration measured in millimeters per hour. So we're actually looking at a rate over time. And so as we fill those rings, then with a stopwatch, we measure how long it takes for that water to infiltrate into the soil. And when that water just ponds on the surface and doesn't infiltrate, those are going to be areas that you're more apt to have runoff. Whereas you want that water to infiltrate very quickly. You want your irrigation water to go into the soil as quickly as possible and not run off down the field. So in our fallow, what we saw, it was just kind of staggered. We initially, everything, the runoff, we were looking at about 25 to 30 millimeters per hour. But what we saw with the wheat is that we actually had, runoff, infiltration. With the wheat, we actually had a very slow, steady infiltration over time. And of course, that was due to just those root channels from the wheat. That allowed us to extend the rate of that infiltration over a greater period. So we did already in year 1 see greater infiltration with the wheat crop. Not really much difference between the radish and the fallow. But that was something that was interesting with that. And so over time we'll see, does that trend hold true? So I mentioned this yield was planted on May the 7th. By May the 28th, there was some stand actually in the area where we had just the fallow as well as the radishes, but there was no stand where we had that wheat cover. And at that point, I thought, okay, again, that wheat cover, there's issues with it, or just the amount of cover going forward. We obviously had not gotten that really terminated, so have we used moisture? What's going on with this? But where we had the stand in just the residue, the cotton plants were very marginal. They were chlorotic, stunted, they weren't very vigorous. It didn't look like we were going to have a corn crop. But going in and actually waiting 1 month post-planting, it was very interesting to see a very quick turnaround in that. So this was actually on June the 7th, where we had the fallow plots. We had 32, and this was planted at 60,000 plants per acre, or seeds per acre. Where we had the fallow, we were looking at right at 32,000 plants per acre. Where we had the wheat, we had about 700 more plants per acre. And then actually, of all things, surprisingly, where we had the radishes, we were right at 34,000 plants per acre. So we were seeing a slight trend for an increased plant stand where we did have those cover crops planted. And then as we progressed, of course, throughout the season, what was really interesting was where we had the wheat cover. As I previously mentioned, the water extraction was very rapid where the wheat cover was because of those more vigorous plants. We saw that in those plants. So looking at actually where we had the wheat cover and corn residue, this would have been on June the 25th. And then here is where we had, of course, just the fallow. And side by side, it was amazing to see the difference between that. These plants were anywhere from 3 to 4 nodes, and we actually, comparing it to where we didn't have any cover, those only had 1 node. So very stunted, very distinct difference just in plant size between the wheat cover and no cover. And then here we are on July the 2nd. So where we had the wheat cover, we had 5 to 6 nodes, and we were at pinhead square. Where we did not have the wheat cover, we were at 4 nodes and did not have any squares. So again, those plants, when they finally came up, even though the germination was delayed, once they got going, they just took off running. Now there was a lot of volunteer corn out here, and that was sprayed throughout the season. But looking at the plant height from the soil surface to the terminal, in the cover we had a 7-inch plant height, and where there was just the corn residue, it was only a 4-inch plant height. So much more vigorous plant in that wheat cover. Another thing that was really interesting throughout the summer, as I mentioned, we planted turnips and we didn't have any turnips last spring. Well, all of a sudden in August, we started finding turnips out there. This is actually a picture that Curtis took, and there was patches where there was a lot of turnips, but throughout these cover crop plots, we had a lot of turnips coming up throughout the season and into the fall. So that was something that was interesting. And I was very surprised that the residual herbicides didn't take care of those turnip seeds. So that was interesting to see those turnips actively growing throughout the late summer and into fall. So of course the question was, well, is this going to hurt the yield? What's going to happen with an actively growing turnip in that corn crop? And so of course the yield really tells the story. Where we had the fallow, just the corn residue, our yield was 1,154 pounds. Where we had the wheat, the yield was 1,330 pounds. And where we had what would be our mixed species, primarily radishes early and turnips later, 1,218 pounds. And statistically, it was significant that the wheat out-yielded the fallow and that mixed species treatment. So, we started off with a very rough season, delayed cotton establishment, delayed seedlings in that wheat covered crop, but we actually yielded more.
Wait, I got a question.
Yes.
Okay, what was your plant stand? What did you drop how many seeds per acre did you drop, and then what was your stand?
Okay, let me back up to that. So we dropped 60,000 seeds per acre, and the plant stand in the fallow was 32,500, and the wheat was 33,200, and in the blend was 34,267. So there was a trend to have a higher stand where we did have those covers, surprisingly. There probably, you look at this 700 plant difference between the fallow and the wheat, probably not a whole lot of difference to make that big of a difference in yield. But we still did see 200-pound difference in lint with that. So, but again, looking at the reduction, we're sitting at probably only 60% of what was dropped made our final stand. So again, of course, even though ultimately what Nick's looking at is trying to optimize quality by increasing stand, the cotton plant has an amazing ability to compensate for low stands. And so, that's what we continue to see. Even though, in many cases, y'all might have come in here on your own fields, thought, I'm terminating this. This is a bad stand. I'm starting with something different. But that plant, it's amazing how it can compensate and really start off the season. Because early in the season, it looked bad. It looked really bad. And this is something that probably because the stands early were so delayed, I'm sure any adjuster would have, terminated this.
When did you make those stand counts?
So all of our stand counts, we do 1 month post-planting. And when I started doing the variety trials several years ago, when we started doing stand counts, we'd go out there 1 week post-planting, 2 weeks post-planting, and we really didn't see that we would get our final stand till 1 month post-planting in this area. And so I can't help but wonder, I know it's easy for me to stand up here and say, well, we can just be patient because, when you have a lot of money riding on this, if you don't have a stand within 2 weeks, you're ready to terminate and move to something else. But that cotton plant, it does, especially if we have a cool spring and wet soils, it just seems to take a while for it to germinate and get going. But once it does, it really is a pretty resilient little plant. What's crazy though, again, back to these stands, if we saw stand counts like that in corn, I guarantee y'all would be calling your seed. Jake knows that. If a farmer drops some corn seed and they only had 60% of it up, oh my gosh, Jake's phone would be ringing off the ear. But for some reason in cotton, this has become more acceptable. But, and while I have always thought this was a problem isolated to the Panhandle, it's not. The National Cotton Council and Cater Hake with the National Cotton Council, he's addressing this on a national level. Throughout the whole Southeast, they have this problem. And a lot of it does go back to just over the years as they have bred for increased lint, seed size has naturally decreased. And so there really does become a point where they've got to work on seed size with that. So, yeah.
Do you have a gut feel for why the germination was better under a cover crop? Was it more moisture? Was it?
Well, so initially the germination was worse.
You ended up with a better plant stand.
Oh, yeah, I think it was protective. So by the time we actually got that cover crop up and going and the plant was more vigorous, I do think there's a lot of value to having that protection. And the wind in the spring here is brutal.
So it's sand blasting.
Yeah, and I don't know if it was so much.
Crusting as well.
Yeah, and of course, we don't have as much crusting. The soil temperature stays cooler. It takes longer for it to germinate because of that. But those plants definitely. He's asking why did we have a better stand later and more vigorous growth in the cover crop than out here in the corn residue? And I do think it goes back just to the protection. Yeah, and you can see these little plants. I mean, of course, part of it, they're chlorotic. There's a little bit of thrips injury on there, but these leaves are just torn from the wind. And this was out here where the stand was established and just the corn residue.